and welcome to Dialogue. Despite a complex and uncertain international environment, the Chinese economy remains relatively stable, with the GDP for the first 3 quarters of the year growing at 4.8% year-on-year. But there are also doubts that China's economy has already peaked and a slowdown is inevitable. So what are the prospects for the world's second largest economy, and how will it manage strained trade relations with the West? To find out more, I'm glad to be joined by Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue, Martin. Earlier this year, you said in an interview that today is a crucial moment in China's economic history that perhaps will determine China's economic development prospects in the next 10 to 20 years. Tell us more on that.
Yes. My view of China's development is that the great success has been the development of productive forces, advancements in technology, huge infrastructure investment, development of the manufacturing sector, which have driven China's growth. But China has also, over a very long period, had a problem with absorbing its excess savings. In other words, consumption is very low in China by comparison with pretty well every other country in economic history, and savings are very, very high. And the problem this creates is that there is a chronic underlying problem of deficient demand. It's a sort of problem that we associate in the West with the thinking of John Maynard Keynes. And this, I think, was obvious already 25 years ago when in the first years of this century, there was enormous current account surplus being run by China. And that was possible only until the financial crisis, when that source of demand, foreign demand in other words, disappeared. So then China shifted to a second way of absorbing excess savings, that is sustaining demand. And I wrote a lot about that at the time, both of these things, in fact. And that was the huge property boom, which absorbed a colossal amount of China's excess savings and generated continued growth, slower growth, but still continued growth at a pretty high rate. But it also created enormous amounts of debt, which began to worry, quite rightly, the policymakers. And beyond a certain point, they started building property which was not going to be valuable. The government has pushed quite rapidly and successfully with new areas of investment, particularly high-tech manufacturing and the development of a clean energy system, both of which are very sensible. Unfortunately, they're not big enough to absorb the excess savings of China. So my view is that this problem of chronically deficient demand or chronic excess savings must now be confronted and dealt with.
Some people are saying that Chinese economy are peaking, meaning double-digit growth or rapid growth is the period for that is gone, and China has to live with low economic growth. But you seems to hold different views. You see Chinese economy is different from that of Japan. Tell us more on that.
Well, what you say, in my view, contains elements of truth and elements of untruth, as it were. So let's consider, first of all, the elements of untruth. It is clear that China has much bigger growth potential now than Japan did in 1990. So in 1990, Japan's GDP per head, national income per head, valued in common international prices, so-called purchasing power parity, was about 80% of US levels. So it had become an advanced country, and its opportunities for very fast growth had largely disappeared. In addition, it was suffering from severe demographic problems, rapid aging, which reinforced that. So Japan could not plausibly grow at more than 2 or 3% a year. It just didn't have the growth potential. Now, China's, of course, made enormous progress, but it's still a relatively poor country. It is still a developing country. Roughly speaking, its GDP per head relative to the US today is about a third, not 80% as Japan's was. And that means China's growth potential is much better than Japan's was, and its investment opportunities are much bigger too. And that's the good news. That's the way in which the Japan comparison is wrong. But there are nonetheless two ways in which it is similar. First of all, China's growth potential has clearly fallen from the 10% or more potential of the years up to about 2012. I don't think anyone believes China can still grow that fast. There is a reasonable debate on how fast it can grow. The most optimistic might say 5 or 6%, and I think potentially that's probably right. It could be maybe 4 or 5%. So it's still faster than high-income countries, very much so, but it's not 10%. And one of the implications of that, which fits in with my earlier argument, is the investment need is lower. Investing 40% of GDP or more in a country that is growing 5% or 6%, still very good, an economy growing at that rate, doesn't really make sense. Investing that much when the country was growing at 10% made lots of sense. But the investment demand is inevitably weaker as the growth rate slows. That's completely normal. And you have to allow for that fact. And because of that, the savings surplus is underlying the economy is going to grow. There's no doubt. And the way I looked at that, I look at something called the incremental capital output ratio, which is the ratio of the investment rate to the growth rate. And in China's fast growth stage, that was 4. So each unit of capital generated 4 units of GDP. And now it's about 8. So that the return on investment has fallen a long way. That's clear. Finally, and that's very like Japan. That's exactly what Japan did in the 80s. It created a huge real estate bubble because it had excess savings, not as much as China, but it was richer. It had excess savings, and it tried to deal with that in the 80s with this huge real estate bubble, and that blew up. And with it, the stock market bubble in 1990, and they've been struggling with excess demand ever since, which is why they had this long period of deflation. That's the similarity. Different growth potential, but that's the structural similarity. And of course, one of the reasons that reinforces that, which is another similarity, is China is also going through a demographic transition as Japan did. And of course, with a lower growth of the labor force and a lower growth of the population, inevitably the growth potential falls. You've still got lots of opportunity to raise productivity. That's why being relatively poor is so valuable. But the expansion of the economy with a growing labor force and population, which you used to have, is gone. So what I'm saying is there are important similarities with Japan, and therefore Japan provides important warnings, but China's opportunities are greater than Japan's. So with the right adjustments, particularly the adjustments in shifting income to wage earners and households, either through public consumption or private consumption, with those sorts of adjustments, I think China can still grow relatively fast, 5% or so for another 10 to 20 years, maybe even longer, and converge more closely on the incomes per head of the high-income countries. And that's the path I think that China should expect to go on.
Of course, besides the domestic economic challenges, of course, if you look at externally, possible potential tariffs as high as 60% if Trump, make good his talk from the U.S. So how do you see the trade in the next 4 years between China and the U.S.? Will the tariff work? I mean, how much damage it will bring about to probably both nations?
Well, I'm strongly opposed to the tariffs. I've written a number of columns saying that they won't work. They will do a lot of damage. They won't achieve a restoration of U.S. manufacturing. They won't achieve a reduction in the U.S. current account and trade deficits. And it will be a big problem for the world economy. So I'm absolutely opposed to these policies. And I'm very concerned about the broader issue of the relations between the US and China because they are so important to the world. And I'm one of the Westerners who think we have to work out a modus vivendi, a way of living together peacefully. I mean, we share this one planet and we have to live together. But you ask a more concrete question, what will these tariffs mean? Well, I think they are going to make it more difficult for Chinese exports. It's unavoidable. And China will obviously try to find other markets. And some of the markets that Chinese companies will try to find will be in Europe and in other high-income countries. And I think that will probably lead to higher trade barriers there too, because they will be concerned about the impact of what is called trade diversion on their own industries, their own automobile industries, their own important industries. So there is a real danger that the protection will spread across the world to other markets, particularly other markets where there are producers that compete with Chinese ones. I would say this reinforces the need to develop China's own markets and to say we are big enough as a country, clearly big enough, to have a mass consumer market of our own, which will absorb what we can produce, or at least a very high proportion of what we can produce. Already the ratio of trade to GDP in China has fallen a long way from its peak. In the early 2000s. It will probably have to fall further towards US levels, which are considerably lower. And that adjustment, which I've already been talking about, will become even more important in the context of this very, very unfortunate and damaging trade war.
What about the effects on let's say, on the US? So will they achieve this reduced trade deficit with China and with other countries, actually with the world? Trump talked about imposing 25% tariff on Mexico, Canada, goods from there. And also, will they be able to bring back the manufacturing jobs? They are trying to force basically companies to produce inside the U.S. or, provide incentives strong enough for those companies. Will Trump succeed?
Well, I have written columns on both of these questions, and I just referred to them, so let me just spell it out. There may be a very partial success, but fundamentally they will fail. The current account deficit of the US is basically the difference between spending by Americans and income of Americans, their own income from their own production. That's basically the current account deficit by definition. So the current account deficit will shrink if and only if income or output rises relative to spending in America by Americans. That's a simplification, but that's more or less the answer. If the Americans spend less than they produce, than they earn from their production, the current account will move into surplus, for example. But to do that, there has to be an increase in output and a reduction in spending. But Mr. Trump is proposing to export to, or more technically deport, millions and millions of workers. And that will shrink output. It won't increase it. So that goes in the wrong direction. Also, Mr. Trump proposes to make tax cuts permanent and quite possibly increase tax cuts. And if he does so, again, spending in America will rise, it won't fall. And these forces will overwhelm the trade policies. The trade policies on their own will not lead to the outcome he wants. And these policies will fight against the trade policies. And I think, therefore, the current account deficit will not shrink, and it's quite likely it will grow. And then on the other question, the manufacturing question, then the truth is that the inevitably the long-term story about manufacturing employment in the United States is that it will shrink. That's what's been happening as a share of employment for the last 40 odd years, and it will continue. They might bring back employment in a few sectors, in a few firms, in certain areas. They may increase particularly their production of chips, which they think is important for security reasons, which I can understand. But the idea that there will be a huge resurgence of manufacturing employment in America is very implausible. By the way, the same applies in China. China is now a relatively developed country with a huge manufacturing sector. From now on, a very high proportion of Chinese people's demand will go on services. That's what's happened to every country at China's level of development. And therefore, employment in services will rise as a share of total employment. Employment in manufacturing will shrink. The share of GDP in manufacturing will probably stabilize and possibly even shrink. So China, too, though it's in a much earlier stage, will also find that in the long run, manufacturing becomes less important in its economy relative to services, because this is the natural progress of countries when they become developed countries, which is obviously what China wants to be. So there's a lesson here for China too, though, of course, China is at a much earlier stage of this development.
Mm-hmm. Well, Martin, you wrote that, it is much easier to blame the disappearance of U.S. manufacturing jobs on China than on domestic consumers and automation. Can you explain more about this automation consumers here?
That's exactly what I'm saying. So that's what I've been saying. Essentially, the point is what determines the share of consumption that goes to manufacturing is consumers' tastes. And what happens as people get richer, the first thing they will buy as they get richer from being very poor is mostly manufactures. It will be food, first of all, food, and then it will be all sorts of manufactured goods. And they will buy their first bicycles, and then their first cars, and then their first washing machines and refrigerators and new houses. But after a while, everybody has a car, everybody has a refrigerator, everybody has a washing machine. The factories that were built to build these things, the steel and everything else have already been built. So you don't need so much investment and investment is very intensive in manufactures too. So demand for manufactures becomes essentially replacement demand. There are a few exceptions, but basically once everybody has all the manufactures they need, then it's just replacement demand, and the same applies to the factories that make them. So at that stage, the manufacturing sector doesn't grow relative to the rest of the economy. In fact, it shrinks. And that's reinforced by the fact that productivity growth in manufacturing is always relatively high. It's much easier to replace people with machines in a factory than it is to replace people in, for example, a restaurant or a hotel or in a school looking after children or in a hospital, all of which require human beings. So services are much more labor intensive, not all, but many are more labor intensive, and they're much more difficult to replace. And services, therefore, as real wages rise, get more expensive. They become a bigger share of GDP, both because people consume more and because they become relatively expensive. Manufacturers being cheaper and people not demanding so much becomes a smaller part of GDP. So over time, as I've already told you, the peak of manufacturing in GDP shrinks and the peak of manufacturing in employment shrinks. And that's a sign of success. That shows the country is becoming a rich country. And that's what's going to happen, indeed, I think is already happening in China. Mm-hmm. And the US, of course, is very advanced in this because it's the richest, biggest country in the world. And so the manufacturing sector, for these reasons, is not going to grow. It's going to shrink. And you just have to accept that. It's going to shrink as a share of output, and it's going to shrink in its demand for workers. And this is something that the US still finds it difficult to accept. It's also something maybe China will find difficult to accept. But beyond a certain point, the manufacturing sector ceases to be the main driver of growth in an economy. It continues to be very, very important, and the sophisticated service sector, in all its different aspects, becomes more important. And that is indeed what's been happening in all the Western world now for a long time. There's no exception. It's happened in Japan, in Germany, in France, in Britain, America. It's happening, and it's now beginning to happen in China. And this is normal. And it's dictated, as you said, by the pattern, the way consumption goes as people get richer, and also the possibility of automation. Let me just say one last thing on that. Obviously, we're now in a world of artificial intelligence. That means we can build more sophisticated robots than ever before. And if you think of many manufacturing processes, robots are ideal. They never get tired. They don't have to eat. They don't need rest breaks. They will continue to work perfectly, smoothly, efficiently, 24 hours a day, well, a little bit of repair. Inevitably, many factories, I'm not saying all, but many factories will basically be staffed by machines with artificial intelligence, computers driving them. And that's where, so by definition, that's not where people will work. And we just have to accept that's the future.
That's the future. Lastly, Martin, something beyond the economy probably. You have observed that in recent years, Western companies have become more focused on political risks and also have sought to diversify their supply chains. But this does not mean, quote, deglobalization. The question now is whether a framework of trust and cooperation can be established. So how should China and the West, in general, rebuild the trust and, get like a new start for cooperation?
Well, that's a very, very big question. I think it is true for political and economic reasons that Western firms, leave aside Western governments, are trying to diversify their supply chains because they have learnt that they can be vulnerable if they are dependent on one supplier because of things that are beyond anyone's fault. For instance, COVID and the ramifications of COVID obviously had this effect. So people are going to try and diversify supply chains. Now, if you diversify supply chains, you obviously go to other countries or back home. In some cases, people will go back home. The US is certainly going to try to go back home. But for many countries, Britain, for example, we can't go back home. There's no chance of being able to produce all the inputs we need and all the products we need at home. We're too small. So beyond a certain point, we will have to remain globalized. The economy will have to remain globalized. And of course, when you look at globalized supply chains in which countries are trying to diversify away from China, well, this is very, very hard because China produces so many products competitively that even if you start buying from other countries, you will find Chinese products embedded in them. So there's some of this is very naive, and I don't know how that's going to work out. The incoming administration is not very sophisticated, so I don't know what they're going to try and do to control the use of Chinese inputs into the supply chains coming from other countries. And of course, for companies, it's less of an issue as long as they know that ultimately this is going to be secure. Now, the bigger issues, however, this is obviously important, but the bigger issues being raised are the desire of the American administration that is coming in to really become self-sufficient. And here, part of it is a long list of complaints about Chinese trade policies, Chinese industrialization policies, theft of intellectual property, other accusations of this kind. And those were the focus of the trade policy in the last Trump administration. But my impression is that it's gone beyond that now. So what they actually want is to move towards self-sufficiency. I think that's impossible. I can't see how that can be done. But it's going to take a long, long time to create a culture of trust between China and the US, which will ameliorate these tensions. The US has now become very, very suspicious towards China and Chinese policymaking. In the case of Europe, it could be easier. Should be easier, but there are still some very big problems. And some of them are about vulnerability in particular sectors. Electric vehicles is an obvious one. This is very significant for Europe because the vehicle manufacturing industry is important. But also, I'm afraid to say, we haven't discussed any of this, there are also geopolitical aspects to all this. We are moving, or we have been moving, towards a world of discrete power blocks, which is not a world that is ruled by economic rationality. And we, in order to generate trust, these tensions between the power blocks of our world have to be diffused radically. And that's going to be very, very difficult because suspicion has now become very, very deep. And I'll just mention in passing, it's impossible really to exaggerate the extent to which Russia's war in Ukraine has destabilized European politics. And that includes its relationships with China. So all this has become incredibly complex geopolitically and ideologically, which I regret very much. But therefore, what we're talking about here is not just about economics, where the problems are obviously significant, but goes beyond it.
With that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to Martin Wolf. You can also watch us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.